There are moments in history when something so fundamental collapses that society itself begins to unravel. In Zimbabwe, that moment came quietly at first. People did not wake up one morning to find their money worthless. Instead, the value of money began slipping slowly, then faster and violently, until one day it was gone. At the peak of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, people carried bags filled with banknotes just to buy basic food. Salaries were spent the moment they were received, not because people were careless, but because waiting even a few hours meant losing everything. Prices changed between sunrise and sunset, and the future became something no one could afford to think about. Hyperinflation is not simply high inflation. It is the total destruction of trust in money. When a currency collapses, it takes savings, pensions, dreams, and stability with it. Money is more than paper. It is a promise that today's work will have value tomorrow. In Zimbabwe, that promise was broken. Once trust disappeared, the economy stopped functioning. Shops emptied, businesses closed, and people stopped planning for the future because the future no longer existed in financial terms. What makes Zimbabwe's story so powerful is that this collapse did not happen in a failed state or a war zone. Zimbabwe was once one of Africa's most productive economies, with fertile land, skilled workers, and a strong currency. This documentary is not just about Zimbabwe. It is about how quickly stability can turn into chaos, how political decisions can destroy money, and why hyperinflation always follows a predictable and deadly path. Zimbabwe's collapse is a warning written in trillion-dollar banknotes, and the world would be foolish to ignore it. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, the country stood at the edge of extraordinary opportunity. It inherited modern infrastructure, productive farmland, functioning banks, and a skilled workforce. Agriculture was the backbone of the economy, producing tobacco, maize, and wheat not only for domestic consumption, but also for export. These exports brought in foreign currency, which allowed Zimbabwe to import fuel, machinery, and medicine. The Zimbabwean dollar was strong, respected, and in its early years, even more valuable than the US dollar. For ordinary citizens, there was genuine hope that independence would bring lasting prosperity. Education levels rose rapidly, healthcare expanded, and urban centers grew. On the surface, Zimbabwe looked like a model for post-colonial success. But beneath this optimism, dangerous cracks were forming. Political power became increasingly centralized. Economic decisions were made to maintain control rather than encourage productivity. Government spending expanded faster than economic growth, and state-owned enterprises became inefficient, corrupt, and dependent on government support. Instead of strengthening institutions, leadership weakened them, slowly replacing accountability with loyalty. By the early 1990s, warning signs were impossible to ignore. Debt increased, productivity slowed, and investor confidence declined. Economic reforms were introduced, then abandoned when they became politically uncomfortable. Rather than confronting structural problems, leaders chose short-term solutions that preserved power but undermined stability. This was the critical phase when Zimbabwe could still have changed course. Instead, denial took root, and once denial replaces discipline, collapse becomes only a matter of time. At the heart of Zimbabwe's economic collapse lay a decision that permanently damaged the country's ability to produce wealth. Land reform, in theory, was meant to correct historical injustice and redistribute farmland more fairly. In practice, it was executed chaotically, violently, and without any economic planning. Large commercial farms, which had formed the backbone of Zimbabwe's agricultural exports, were seized rapidly and often handed to individuals with little farming experience or political connections rather than agricultural expertise. The result was immediate and devastating. Fields once carefully managed fell into neglect, irrigation systems broke down, and harvests collapsed within a few seasons. Agriculture was not just one sector of the economy. It was the foundation on which everything else rested. Export crops such as tobacco brought in foreign currency, which allowed Zimbabwe to import fuel, spare parts, fertilizers, medicines, and industrial equipment. When farm production collapsed, export revenue disappeared. Without foreign currency, imports dried up. Factories slowed or shut down, transportation systems broke down, and basic goods became scarce. Inflation began rising, not because people had too much money, but because there were fewer goods available to buy. This distinction is crucial, because inflation driven by scarcity is far more dangerous than inflation driven by demand. The government responded not by fixing production, but by blaming conspiracies. Farmers were accused of sabotage. Foreign governments were blamed for sanctions. Businesses were accused of hoarding. None of these explanations addressed the real issue. The economy was no longer producing enough food or exports to sustain itself. You cannot print crops, and you cannot command productivity through political slogans. Once agricultural output collapsed, the economy lost its ability to feed itself and earn foreign income, pushing the nation toward dependence on money printing to survive. This chapter marks the true turning point in Zimbabwe's story. Hyperinflation does not begin at the printing press. It begins when production is destroyed. Once a country consumes more than it produces, the gap must be filled somehow. Zimbabwe chose to fill that gap with newly printed money. From this moment onward, hyperinflation was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. By the late 1990s, Zimbabwe's leadership was under intense political pressure. Economic growth had slowed, unemployment was rising, and public frustration was becoming increasingly visible. Among the most vocal groups were war veterans fighters from the independence struggle who felt forgotten and marginalized. Instead of addressing their demands through structured pensions or long-term economic programs, the government chose a decision driven by political survival rather than economic reality. In 1997, it approved massive, unbudgeted cash payments and monthly pensions for war veterans, financed not by savings or productivity, but by borrowing and direct money creation. The impact was immediate and severe. The Zimbabwean dollar collapsed almost overnight, losing a significant portion of its value in a single day. Investor confidence evaporated, and the message sent to financial markets was clear. Fiscal discipline no longer existed. Government spending surged beyond control, while revenue continued to fall due to declining production. The state began operating on promises rather than resources, covering the gap by forcing the central bank to inject new money into the economy. This moment revealed a dangerous shift in policy. Economic management was no longer about sustainability, it was about appeasement. Public sector wages were increased to calm unrest, subsidies expanded to hide shortages, and failing state-owned enterprises were kept alive through constant financial support. None of these measures increased productivity or growth. They merely postponed collapse while making it far worse. Each new promise required more money, and each batch of printed currency weakened the value of every dollar already in circulation. Populism replaced policy. Any criticism was dismissed as unpatriotic or foreign-driven. Economists who warned of inflation were ignored, while businesses were blamed for rising prices. But inflation was not caused by greed. It was caused by excess money chasing fewer goods. The government had crossed a critical line. It was now spending money that did not exist, supported by an economy that could no longer produce what it consumed. From this point onward, hyperinflation was not a question of if, but when. Once Zimbabwe's government committed itself to unlimited spending, the role of the central bank changed completely. Instead of protecting the value of the currency, it became a tool for financing government deficits. When tax revenues fell and borrowing options disappeared, the solution was simple and disastrous: print more money. At first, this expansion of the money supply seemed harmless. New notes entered circulation, government salaries were paid, and basic services continued. But beneath the surface, the foundations of trust were cracking. The problem was not merely that money was being printed, but that it was being printed into an economy that was producing less every year. Factories were closing due to shortages of raw materials, farms were failing, and exports had collapsed. More money was chasing fewer goods, and prices began to rise rapidly. Inflation accelerated from uncomfortable to alarming, then from alarming to uncontrollable. Instead of slowing down, the government increased the pace of printing, believing that more money would somehow solve shortages and calm public anger. As prices rose, the state blamed businesses. Price controls were imposed, forcing shops to sell goods below cost. This decision emptied shelves almost overnight. Producers could not afford to manufacture goods at controlled prices, and retailers stopped stocking items they could not sell profitably. Shortages worsened, and black markets flourished. Goods that were officially unavailable suddenly appeared at many times the controlled price, accessible only to those with connections or foreign currency. Each intervention destroyed more trust. People stopped saving because savings were being erased by inflation. Businesses stopped investing because planning became impossible. The central bank responded by printing even larger denominations, adding zeros to banknotes as if changing numbers could change reality. But inflation is not a numerical problem. It is a confidence problem. By this stage, the public understood a brutal truth. The government would continue printing money no matter the consequences. And once that belief took hold, hyperinflation became unstoppable. By the mid-2000s, Zimbabwe had entered the most destructive phase of hyperinflation, where time itself became an enemy. Prices no longer rose over months or weeks. They rose within days, then hours. A loaf of bread purchased in the morning could cost twice as much by evening. Shop owners stopped printing price tags because they became outdated before they could be placed on shelves. In many stores, prices were written in pencil so they could be erased and rewritten repeatedly throughout the day. Money was losing value so quickly that holding cash even briefly became a guaranteed loss. The rhythm of daily life was completely distorted. Employers began paying workers twice a day, and in some cases 3 times, simply so employees could rush out and spend their wages before prices rose again. People ran from banks to markets the moment salaries were deposited, creating long queues and chaos. Saving became irrational. Pensions that had taken decades to build were wiped out in months. The middle class, which relies on stable money more than any other group, was effectively erased from society. Psychologically, hyperinflation changed how people thought. Long-term planning vanished. Education, careers, and investments lost meaning when survival was the only priority. Trust between people weakened as scarcity intensified competition. The future became too expensive to imagine. Money had ceased to function as a store of value and was barely functioning as a medium of exchange. What remained was panic, speed, and constant loss. This phase revealed the true cruelty of hyperinflation. It does not just destroy economies, it reshapes human behavior. When money dies, morality, patience, and cooperation are tested to their limits. Zimbabwe had crossed into a zone where recovery would require more than policy changes. It would require the death of the currency itself. By the time Zimbabwe reached the peak of hyperinflation, daily life had become a relentless struggle for survival. Ordinary citizens, once confident in their savings and salaries, found themselves navigating a world where nothing had predictable value. Shops were empty or stocked with goods that were too expensive for the majority. Lines at banks stretched for hours as people tried desperately to convert cash into tangible goods before the next price surge. Barter, once rare, became commonplace, and foreign currency, particularly US dollars or South African rand, was treated as more reliable than the national currency. In many neighborhoods, survival required ingenuity. Exchanging clothing, household items, or even labor directly for food and essentials became the norm. Families faced constant anxiety. Parents rationed meals not just to make ends meet, but because the value of money could vanish within a single day. Children grew up witnessing a society where planning for the future was meaningless. Professional workers, doctors, teachers, engineers were often paid in devalued local currency. They could not cover basic expenses. Skilled laborers either fled the country, emigrating to escape economic collapse, or were forced to take menial jobs just to survive. Trust between neighbors and even within families sometimes eroded, as the scarcity of goods and the desperation for survival pushed ordinary people to extreme measures. Hyperinflation also affected social and cultural life. Weddings, funerals, and celebrations became difficult to organize because costs were unpredictable and rapidly escalating. Traditional economic markers, such as bank balances, income, or rents, lost all meaning. In many cases, individuals relied on informal networks, family connections, and bartering communities to meet even the most basic needs. The everyday reality was not only financial ruin, but a profound psychological strain. Money had become not just worthless, but irrelevant, and the social cohesion that once defined communities began to fracture under the relentless pressure of economic collapse. This chapter illustrates a brutal truth. Hyperinflation is not just a financial problem, it is a human one. It touches every aspect of life, reshaping society in ways that last for decades. In Zimbabwe, the currency did not simply fail, it transformed daily existence into a constant battle between hope and despair, turning normal routines into complex strategies for survival. By 2008, Zimbabwe's hyperinflation had reached a surreal and almost unimaginable level. The numbers on banknotes grew exponentially as the central bank attempted to keep up with soaring prices. What was once a $10 note became meaningless, replaced by hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, and eventually trillions of Zimbabwean dollars. The government issued a $100 trillion banknote, a denomination so staggering that it defied comprehension. Yet, despite the astronomical numbers, these notes could barely buy a loaf of bread or a bus ticket. The currency, which had once represented decades of work and savings, had become a symbol of total economic collapse. The printing of such enormous denominations did not solve problems, it deepened them. The psychological impact on the population was devastating. People lost faith not only in the currency, but in the state itself. Money that had been the lifeblood of the economy became a burden to carry, a source of shame, and a reminder of the futility of trusting institutions. Hyperinflation, at this point, was no longer a financial phenomenon. It had become a societal disease, eroding confidence, trust, and social cohesion. Workers demanded immediate payment, consumers hoarded goods, and shops refused cash transactions, insisting on foreign currency or barter. Each new note, regardless of its face value, was worthless the moment it left the printing press. The death of the Zimbabwean dollar was not only numeric, it was symbolic. It demonstrated the ultimate consequence of economic mismanagement, political denial, and unrestrained money printing. Once trust in a currency evaporates, no amount of paper, no new denomination, and no government proclamation can restore it. The hyperinflation had transformed the nation as daily reality into a chaotic theater where survival depended less on money and more on ingenuity, connections, and access to foreign currency. Zimbabwe's trillion-dollar notes stand as historical testimony to the extreme danger of allowing confidence in money to collapse completely. After years of relentless hyperinflation, Zimbabwe reached a point where its own currency had lost all credibility. In 2009, the government made a momentous decision. It effectively abandoned the Zimbabwean dollar and allowed foreign currencies, primarily the US dollar and South African rand, to be used for transactions. This process, known as dollarization, did not immediately solve all economic problems, but it brought an abrupt and necessary stabilization to the financial system. Prices stopped doubling daily, businesses could plan again, and ordinary citizens could finally save money without fear that it would vanish overnight. Dollarization, however, came with profound social and economic consequences. While it stabilized currency value, it also highlighted the depth of the collapse and the long-lasting damage to Zimbabwe's institutions. For years, the central bank had printed money irresponsibly, eroding not only the economy, but the very trust that underpins financial systems. Even after stabilization, the scars of hyperinflation remained visible in the form of lost savings, diminished pensions, and a middle class that had been decimated. For ordinary people, the transition to foreign currency meant both relief and a stark reminder of how completely their national money had failed. The end of hyperinflation illustrates a critical lesson. Hyperinflation never ends naturally. It does not self-correct. Recovery only begins when confidence is restored, often by abandoning the currency that has failed. Dollarization in Zimbabwe allowed commerce to function again and halted the extreme destruction of wealth. But it also revealed a deeper truth about money. It is not just paper, it is trust, belief, and social agreement. Once that trust is lost, no government decree, no amount of new notes, and no promises of reform can restore it overnight. Zimbabwe's painful experience stands as a warning to all nations that money is only as strong as the faith people have in it. The story of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation is not just a historical case study, it is a warning for the modern world. It illustrates the fragile nature of money, the dangers of unchecked political decisions, and the human cost of economic collapse. There are no shortcuts, no easy solutions, and no escape from the consequences of ignoring economic reality. Zimbabwe teaches us that hyperinflation does not occur in isolation. It begins with systemic mismanagement, poor policy decisions, the destruction of productive sectors, and the loss of trust between a government and its people. Once confidence in money evaporates, even the most sophisticated financial tools cannot restore stability. The printing press cannot replace production, and the highest denomination notes cannot replace trust. One of the most important lessons is psychological. Money is more than a medium of exchange. It is a symbol of societal trust and cooperation. When that trust is broken, people act not in accordance with logic or rules, but out of fear and desperation. Savings vanish, salaries are spent instantly, and barter replaces currency. Daily life becomes a survival exercise, where planning for the future is impossible. These human effects are as devastating as the financial losses themselves and take decades to repair. Another lesson is structural. Hyperinflation is always preventable. It requires discipline, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths before they escalate into disaster. Zimbabwe had resources, talent, and potential, yet political expediency and denial led to ruin. The collapse of the Zimbabwean dollar, the printing of trillion-dollar notes, and the eventual abandonment of national currency serve as vivid reminders of what happens when institutions fail and trust evaporates. Finally, Zimbabwe's experience is timeless. While the circumstances were specific land reform, political pressures, and government spending, the underlying dynamics are universal. Human behavior repeats. Greed, denial, and short-term thinking often triumph over prudence. Modern economies, whether they deal with fiat currency, cryptocurrency, or other financial systems, remain vulnerable to the same patterns of collapse if trust is lost. Zimbabwe is not just history. It is a warning. The survival of a nation's economy depends less on money itself and more on the faith of the people who use it. And when that faith is broken, even the strongest currency becomes worthless overnight. In the end, hyperinflation in Zimbabwe teaches a simple but profound lesson. Money is only powerful as long as people believe in it. And once that belief is gone, no note, no bank, and no policy can restore it. The story is a cautionary tale for governments, economists, and citizens alike. Vigilance, responsibility, and trust are the true currencies of a stable society.